Hi, it's Alex. Today I want to take a look at the bilateral relationship with a couple of examples. You remember from your cheat sheet that a bilateral relationship is where a proposition supports two other propositions, one preceding and one following, and we're using the conjunctions for ground and inference here. Ground being words like for, because, since; inference being words like therefore, wherefore, consequently, accordingly. And you're going to see both of those used in the bilateral relationship, because in the bilateral relationship we have a conclusion followed by a premise that is the reason for or the ground for that conclusion, but then it's also followed by another conclusion. So we could arc it, draw our three arcs. If only we had these first two, we would arc it as a ground, a conclusion, and the reason for that. And if we only had the second two, we would arc it as an inference, because you'd have the premise and then the conclusion that is therefore reached because of the premise. However, because we can't cross arcs, there is a bilateral relationship that goes in both directions, and so we label this as bilateral, and we draw it almost like in the case of a series. We draw an arc over all three of these propositions to say that the bilateral relationship is going in both directions. That right here we have a because, and right here we have a therefore. And I can write this in as well. We have a because or ground, and then right here we have a therefore or a wherefore, etc. That we have these sandwiched together, a conclusion, a premise, and another conclusion. Now let me give you a couple examples of what this looks like in the actual text of Scripture. The first example I want to give you is from Exodus 15:23. Let me read it. When they came to Marah, you remember the place of bitter water, which is exactly what we're talking about. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. Therefore, it was named Marah. And this should jump out because we have this because, which signals generally a ground relationship here, and yet it's followed by this therefore. And so we have this because, therefore combo. Then it's going to be one of the signals that we have a conclusion and a premise followed by another conclusion immediately. And so we might not have either the ground or the inference, or maybe appropriately it would be appropriate to say that we have both the ground and the inference relationship in a bilateral relationship. So let me show you how I would arc this when I come to it. First, I see this temporal relationship here. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah. And then I run into, as I've already pointed out, this word because, and so I'm tempted to simply draw one arc over this and call this the ground, which it certainly is. They could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. So this is the ground, this is the premise for this conclusion. Why could they not drink it? Because it was bitter. So the bitterness here is the premise, and yet it's followed immediately by another conclusion. Therefore, it was named Marah. So instead of labeling this ground or inference, I'm going to bring both of those relationships in by labeling this bilateral and drawing one arc over all three, because I see that I have a premise right here that leads to these two conclusions. It supports conclusions in both directions. This conclusion here that they could not drink the water of Mara, and this conclusion here, that it was the reason they named it Mara, or as you know, bitter. They called it bitter because it was bitter. So we have one premise that supports two conclusions in both directions, and we see this because and therefore combo that clues us in to this bilateral relationship. Let me show you one more example of how this works out. In Romans chapter 2, verses 1b through 2, okay, this is a very specific example here. For, and that points toward what Paul is arguing for that came before this in chapter 1 through chapter 2, verse 1. For, he says, in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, practice the very same things. Period. We know that the judgment of God rightly falls on those who practice such things. So we have what we're tempted to see as maybe a ground relationship here, but then that leaves verse 2 here for us to consider how it relates to what came before. And so we can consider what the best way is to arc this passage as we begin. Where my eye goes first is to these two propositions 1b and c. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself. The main action here is you condemn yourself, and then we have an action-manner relationship here, or a manner-action. They're reversed here, because the main action is you're condemning yourself. And what is the manner in which this person is condemning themselves? They're condemning themselves in or by passing judgment on someone else. So we have an action manner, and then that leads to this keyword here, because you, the judge, practice the very same thing. So we could, if we wanted to, we could say, oh, this is a ground, because I see the word because here that clues me in that this is a ground relationship. In passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself because you, the judge, practice the very same things. And if that's all we had in the passage, that would be true. However, we go on to this next statement. We know that the judgment of God rightly falls on those who practice such things. And it leaves us asking, what is this relationship right here? And it seems like that this same premise also leads to this conclusion. We have one conclusion, that in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself. And the reason for that is because you who are judging practice the very same things. And then we start to hear the word therefore implied right here. I want to try this on for size, so I'm just going to write this in. Therefore, we know that the judgment of God rightly falls on those who practice such things. And I can read that over and see if that works. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, practice the very same things. Therefore, we know that the judgment of God rightly falls on those who practice such things. It does seem like, as I read over that we have this same because, therefore construction here that we saw up above in Exodus 15. Because, therefore, which points us to this reality. There's a premise that's supporting conclusions in both directions here. So I'm going to get rid of this arcing out as simply a ground, and I'm going to come back and reassign this in a way that I think makes the most sense out of this passage as a bilateral relationship, where this premise is supporting conclusions in both of these directions. The premise here is that you, the judge, practice the very same things you're judging. Therefore, one conclusion is you condemn yourself, and the other conclusion is we know that the judgment of God rightly falls on those who practice such things. And we have a because and a therefore construction here, which points us to that bilateral relationship. It's a unique relationship in that it's a combination of the ground and the inference using this because, therefore construction to bring one premise to bear on two conclusions. So you're not going to see that all the time, but now you'll be in a better position to deal with it when you come across it in Scripture. And that's a couple examples of how I would arc the bilateral relationship.